Okay. Any questions about the required readings? Okay. Like I said in my email, but I'll repeat it for those of you who didn't receive my email. I don't mind if you use other copies than the ones at the Brandon the bookstore, right? Mostly, again, because I've been in your position. I know that budgets are not unlimited necessarily. Okay, so if you find used copies, that's totally fine. There is no distinction between various editions. The Wars hasn't been modified since it came out in 1977. Okay, Angélique either has not changed in the 30 years since it was published. And the Marrow Thieves just came out, or just came out 10 years ago, but there's no second edition necessarily. Okay, so none of this will matter if you get different or older editions. Okay, the only thing that will change is maybe the page numbers. Okay, if I reference a certain page number, so that might be a little bit more difficult, but we'll try to make it work. Yeah.
What if you get like an online copy?
An online copy is fine. I don't mind it at all. Yeah, I don't mind at all if you get an online copy. Yeah. Just to return back to this idea of digital copies, as a general rule, I don't mind that you use digital things as long as it's not distracting, right? Which is a very difficult and tall order, considering the nature of these electronic devices. They're meant to be distracting and cumbersome. I'm not such a Philistine and a Luddite that I will, want to destroy all of your computers. Okay. By the way, you just walked in. What's your name? Awesome. Okay. Yep. Where are you? Oh yeah, Boulevard. There you go. Good. All right. Any other questions on that aside from digital editions? Okay, good. Now, evaluations. We're finally coming back to Mark's question. So for this class, you have 3 short essays, a final exam, and the participation grade. I find that a lot. I will admit, right, considering how short the class is, if it were up to me, it would not be that. But I was hamstrung by the department, literally. For those of you who have taken English classes before, apparently there's like a certain number of requirements of what kinds of evaluations you need to do, which honestly took me by surprise when I was hired here. Because in my previous university experiences, I could basically do whatever I wanted, however I wanted. I was the ultimate free person, right? The freest individual that could ever exist as a teacher. So I arbitrarily kind of gave the deadline as our last day of class, right, during the week on Thursdays. But as Mark said, yeah, that's fine if you give it in on Friday. Okay, we can make it a general rule that Friday's the deadline. We'll say Friday 9 p.m. just to give an arbitrary time. But because we're so few in class, I'm flexible, right? Don't give it in like a week late. That's a bit stretching it. But yeah, it doesn't really matter as long as I get it before the start of the next week. Okay, because I'll use the weekend to basically look them over, grade them, so on and so forth. Okay, because I'm not from around here, I have nothing better to do, literally, than to look at your work, right? And I don't want to disparage the people who live here. Brandon is a lovely town, but it's not like it's booming with activities during the weekend, right? And I don't have a car, so, I will only have that to do, okay? Yeah, I have nothing else to add on that. That's basically it. Yeah, go ahead.
Like on the syllabus with the late policy, then
yeah.
Just not going to really pay attention to the grade for day late type situation.
No, because I added that before knowing that we were so few in class. So
I'll clarify that.
Yep, good. Do I need to modify the syllabus in order to make that clear? No, okay. I'll modify it for me personally, just so I don't forget and accidentally penalize you 5% because I can barely remember what I've had for breakfast. So, okay. So yeah, first essay 10%, second essay 15%, and third essay 20%. Each each essay has a specific word count, or a broad idea of a word count. So if you've looked on the Moodle, you'll see that each essay section each essay section, right, has the indicated word count that I broadly expect. Okay, for this, let me know if you can't see it. But for the first essay, let me pull it up here. I think it was about 500 words. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's 500 to 600 words.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So 500 to 600. Again, I'm flexible. I gave 500 to 600 because it seemed like an arbitrary and longish but not too long place to start for a 10% evaluation. Okay, but as a general rule, for as a teacher, I value quality over quantity. Okay. And yeah, that's pretty much that. I have more to say about the essays, but I think, so essay 2, what's the page length?
6 to 750.
Yeah, Mark,
I'm on it.
No, it's good. It's good. I always need a mark in class. And the third one is up to 1,000 words. Okay. All right. So there are two options for the essays. Okay. So for the conventional essay, okay, because they're so short, what I'm basically expecting from you is a small, concise, and precise, right? Keyword here, concise and precise, argument about one of the texts that we read that week. Okay. I think, it was you, Ada, that reached out about the essay, right?
That's right.
Okay, good. So, I put this on the instructions for essay number 1, but it basically applies to all of the essays. Okay, that's why I didn't add it to all of them, but I can later. Now's not the time to reinvent the wheel with a brand new literary theory that you're gonna, absolutely analyze the hell out of one of the poems with. Okay, more power to you if you eventually get to that point in your life where you want to do that. That is not my expectation for this class. Okay, so as I put it in the essay number 1 instructions, let me pull it up here. Oh, why doesn't it? Do you all see the instructions? No. Oh, weird. Because I put it in.
Save your file stuff and submit.
Because I put it in activity instructions here. Okay, well, I'll figure it out later. But basically, here we'll go with this. So there's the formal version of this, which is basically a short reflection I hate my handwriting so much ever since I've stopped needing to write on a board because of the beauty that is PowerPoint. But anyway, so a short reflection on a specific element of a text. Okay? Any text of your choice, right? As long as it's from that week of class. Okay? So when I say an element of your choice, it can be things like the plot, right? So on week 3, we're doing a play. Admittedly, the plot is not the most important part of that play. Okay, we'll talk about it, but there is still one. Okay, so if you want to analyze the particulars of that plot, okay, or you have something really interesting to say about what happens, right, story-wise in that play, fantastic. Okay. If you have something to say about a character, okay, same thing. What other elements are there? So we can talk about form. Okay? So this especially applies to poetry, okay, when we talk about different types of poetry. Although, as we'll see later, a lot of contemporary poetry specifically disavows any kind of form, so you might be screwed on that one. But just to come back real quick to the idea of theater, there's a reason why Lorena Gale wrote a play, right, rather than a novel, rather than a poem, rather than a graphic novel. Okay, so understanding why an author chose the form that they did can be a fruitful place for analysis. And the list can go on and on and on. If you want to go specifically with poetry, you can talk about lineation and enjambment, which are big boy words in poetry. So if you haven't taken a poetry class, I might come back to some of those elements. So what was I going to say? Because of the short nature of these assignments, right, 500 words goes by very quickly, okay, or at least I find. I'll be more focused on you making, like I said, a clear argument, and you don't need to worry too much about the 5-paragraph essay structure type of thing of an introduction and 3 arguments and a conclusion, right? As long as I can identify a point that you're making, you will get your points. Okay? Does that make sense so far for everyone? Okay. I see some smiles developing. Like, I feel that this is not the norm for a lot of teachers.
I was just thinking it would be funny to do the 5-paragraph essay, but just like a sentence for each, because it's so short. It would be like poetry.
Okay, so that gets me to my second point. You do have an alternative for the essays, okay? And I actually did get departmental approval for this one. So I'm comfortable actually doing it, and this ties into Mel's point. I started doing this last time I taught a uni class. You do have a creative option that you can take, okay? And I would qualify what you just said, Mel, as part of that creative option. Okay? Now, before you jump onto this opportunity, this is not a chance for you to just do whatever and get points for it. Okay, there is somewhat of a structure to this creative element, right, or this creative alternative if you want to take it. And mostly the idea is that instead of writing an essay, you rewrite one of the texts, or a part of the text. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you to rewrite a novel, okay, in the space. Yeah. Thank you. One of the texts. Thank God I'm an English teacher and I know how to spell. What was I going to say? So that's part 1. And just to give it a little bit more structure, right, and give me something to formally evaluate if anyone at admin ever asks, okay? Part 2 would be to justify, right, or to give a little bit of critical self-reflection as to why you rewrote a particular text in that way. Okay? I'll give an example. So for today, I asked you to read maybe a poem by Jeannette Armstrong called History Lesson. Okay? And Armstrong wrote that poem from a very specific perspective, right? She's an Okanagan Native woman, okay? And she was talking about a very specific history moment, right? Historical moment. And that's what informs the poem, okay? Her, place as an Okanagan, or her existence as an Okanagan woman, informs the voice of that poem. Her personal perspective on history, her knowledge of history, her knowledge of poetry, all inform that poem that you see on the movie. So if you wanted to rewrite, right, your own quote-unquote history lesson, right, you could absolutely do that. So we'll come back to that in a second. And when I say a second, probably in like half an hour when I finally circle back around to it. But history lesson is about the arrival of Christopher Columbus into North America, right? Or America, right? He never came to North America. But arrival of Christopher Columbus to America. So you, right, I don't know if any of you are Indigenous, but if you're not, for example, you can reframe that same moment from your own perspective as a 21st century digital person who's not necessarily writing from an Okanagan perspective, right? That could be an option. Okay? Or maybe you can rethink of that exact moment, right? But the arrival of a different person, right? Like, I don't know, Jacques Cartier in Quebec, right? Just to take my own local example. Okay? And so on and so forth. And then you explain why you made those changes or what impact those changes have on your understanding of the poem or what you think it adds to whatever topic you wanted to discuss. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay. Yes. Remind me your name. I'm sorry. Annalie, go.
Also, like, I'll do my own poem kind of thing. That's also my own poem, and then just have like a paragraph and a slide. That's a good book.
Mm-hmm.
And you can
try to
for either one, or is that our first one?
No, so either one for any of them. Okay. As an educator who has a boss, technically, I should, I guess, say, try to limit the creative option to once in the semester, okay, and focus on like developing the proper academic style of writing the essay because it'll be important for someone someday and whatever. But also, if you want to write all three as creative options, I'm totally okay with that. Off the record. But no, seriously, like all jokes aside, I do think it was a fruitful exercise for the last class that I did this in, mostly because it gave them a deeper appreciation of why the author understudy made the creative decisions that they did, right? Because much as we sometimes don't notice it, authors do write with intention, right? There's a reason why they chose the particular words or the particular style and the particular form that they did. Okay? And changing that doesn't necessarily make the poem worse, it just makes it different, right? Or the play different. Okay? And all of that matters to our understanding of why a work of art exists in the way that it does. Okay? And when I say rewrite, I should add as well, try to stay within the word limit that I've established for the formal essay. Okay, it might be a little bit difficult if you rewrite a poem, right? Just because it'll mean that you have to do a little bit more of like the critical self-reflection. Okay? But try as much as possible, right, to stay within that same word count. Okay? I think that's all I had to say about this. I'm just thinking on the fly here. Creative instruction. Yeah, this might be easier by the end of the semester. I have had students who took the rewrite part into really wild directions. Like they changed the medium entirely, right? I had a student who did like a collage response to a novel that we had done in class, right, last semester. So she did a collage that was a response to Don DeLillo's White Noise, right? And it made sense, right? It was fine. It was a really good piece. But of course, she had the benefit of having many, many weeks to work on this. Okay, so you are, flexible in your creativity. I'm not going to limit you, but I am aware that there are time constraints that might limit what exactly you can do as far as like creative responses are concerned. Okay? Do the best that you can if you want. Okay. Good. So. Before I move on, any questions about the essays or anything of the sort? Good. I have nothing else to add, so I would be shocked if anyone had any questions. All right. So, looking at the syllabus, the final exam is pretty self-explanatory. I don't have the questions yet. Usually what I do for exams, which again I'm obligated to do in this class, is that I formulate the questions as I go throughout the semester based off of what we have time to discuss in class. Okay? Because as you can see, I have notes, right, prepared, but as we'll get to in a second, these are not the end-all be-all of the class. Okay? I have not thought of every single possibility for the pieces of literature under study. You might bring up a point that will take us in a completely different direction than I had anticipated. Okay? And that will be just as productive a part of the class. Okay? And that might also end up in the exam. We'll see. Okay? So I don't like to kind of shoehorn myself into pre-writing an exam and therefore forcing the class into a specific direction that goes against my values as a human being. Yes, Annalie, you had your hand.
I look this up. Is the exam still 6 to 9 p.m. on the Monday? Or is it different time?
As far as I know, it's 6 to 9. Which, I'm sorry, if it were up to me, it would not be at that time. This class would also not be from 6 to 9 p.m. So it's a weird time to have a class. I'm well aware of that. Not my decision. Literally, I have no skin in this game. Okay. Any other questions about the final exam? Yeah. Oh, no, go ahead. Please.
Are we going right till 9?
Okay. So I don't care, right? Because I have nothing else to do, right? But, yeah, how many of you are taking like other classes during the spring 2 semester? Okay, so some of you. Damn, okay. At 8 a.m. the next day, I assume some of you? Okay, some of you. All right. Usually the way I work with, 3-hour classes like this is that I do maybe like an hour and a half, take a solid break just to stretch our legs, get a coffee, although a coffee at this time means that you're not going to sleep for the rest of the night, but whatever, right? Go get a sandwich, whatever you need to, power through. And then we kind of go for the rest of the time. And this is true no matter when I teach a class. I stop whenever we have nothing else to say. Okay, I don't force the 3 hours. Sometimes we will take the 3 hours. Okay, we might not today because of technical difficulties that are unforeseen. But I try to do as much of the 3 hours as I can. Okay, and I think I have chosen pieces of literature that will allow us to do that. Okay, but if something doesn't grab you, we run out of things to say at 8:30. We'll stop. Okay. Part of my reason for trying to, give all the way to 9 as much as possible is because, you've paid to take this class, right? Like, I genuinely value that. Okay. As much as I would want education to be free and, us be unburdened by these kind of shackles of monetary value ascribed to something like an arts education or a liberal arts education, that's simply not the case, right? So I try to give as much of the bang for your buck as you possibly can. I don't know if that answered your question. The short answer is probably, right? Long answer, longer answer, maybe not. Right? Are you asking because you want to finish early?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, at least you're honest about it. That's okay. I'm sorry.
Can we not take a break and just work right through to be done earlier?
Okay, so show of hands, how many of you just don't?
Like eight already.
Okay, 6 to 8's pushing it a little bit. So like how many of you wouldn't want to take a break? No break. And just like finish a little bit earlier. And usually I take like a 10-minute break, so it wouldn't be that much earlier. Probably we'd finish around 8:45, 8:50. All right, well, it's better than nothing. We'll see. Again, we'll play it by ear. But okay, it gives me some sense. Any other technical questions? Okay. Participation, I mentioned it earlier. One of the ways that I half evaluate this, and this is one of the reasons why I try to get your names as early as possible, is that not only do I kind of give you arbitrary points based off of your actual engagement, right, with your peers and with me. Okay, we'll be doing some activities sometimes in class, some creative, some more formal. Okay, but one of the easier ways that I think students can get participation grades is by actually coming to class prepared. Okay, which seems like a tautology, right? The most obvious thing that a teacher can say, well, come to class having done the readings. Duh, right? But what I mean by that is one of the ways that I think students have gotten the most out of the classes that I've taught is, for example, by coming to class with a specific passage that they found particularly interesting, right? Or say, for example, tomorrow I'm giving you a series of poems to read, right? Choosing one poem that really grabbed you, right? Or if we're talking about Angélique in class number 3, a scene, right? That was of particular interest. Okay? And already that's an easy way for you to have something to actually use as an example in class or to discuss, right, in class if you are called upon. Okay? And I will, by the way, call upon you. Sometimes at random, sometimes just in the flow of conversation, right? I'll just go up and say, Ash, right? It's Ash. Okay. Ash, what did you like about this week's reading, right, or today's reading, right? And, if Ash clearly demonstrates that she has read the text, right, then fantastic, right? If Ash suddenly says, maybe gives me some indication that Ash did not come prepared to class, right? So, it's little things like that that are pretty obvious. Yeah.
So it's like you read the text, but you never specifically call on me, but I never say anything. Is that going to take the participation, or it's just based on the questions you ask? You know what I mean?
It's a bit of both.
Yeah.
It is based off of the questions I ask. I do try to get at least one person, each person's participation at some point during the semester, right? If I forgot,
that's what
it happens that I forgot that I've forgotten in the past, but it's rare.
Okay.
My memory's not that bad. I said she. Is that good? Yes.
Did that count as participant? I'm joking.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions about the participation? Usually, my way of remembering is immediately after class. I'll just make a note. Be like, yeah, it said something, and that's cool, right? Something constructive, of course, not just here present, right?
Well, that's also relevant, yes, being here.
Yes, I mean, of course, it's relevant. Physically being here. That's part of why I mentioned about the electronic devices earlier, of them being too distracting. It does show when you're just scrolling through Reddit or whatever the new thing is. I don't know, but that does hinder your ability to participate at the end of the day, right? So, as much as possible, we'll try to avoid it. All right. Good news, everyone. the boring part of class is finished. Yay! And it only took 47 minutes. Good God. Okay. So last technical point, and I know that some students sometimes prefer this. I do this for a mix of reasons. Some students have requirements for this of recording the class, but I also just do it as a general rule for everyone. Okay, so currently my laptop is recording what I am saying. Okay, and after class, I save that file and put it on Moodle for everyone to use at their discretion. Okay. Part of the reason for this is for your own benefit, right? Sometimes I know myself, I tend to speak very, very quickly and about a lot of different topics, right? That's just my way of being. I make weird connections sometimes that eventually 25 to 30 minutes later come back to the original point that I was going to make and make sense for me alone. Okay? And that's part of the reason for those recordings is that sometimes students find it useful to kind of go back onto what I've said in order to make sure that they understood what we were talking about. Okay? On a related note, I know that some students have also found it helpful when studying for exams, right? That, they just listen to the classes that they think will be relevant, just to get a refresher off of what we've talked about. Please do not use this as an excuse to not show up to class, okay? I always must make this caveat because I will not hesitate to stop recording if I notice that, class participation and attendance dwindles very rapidly and clearly, right? I'm doing this for your pedagogical benefit, not because I'm just a cushy professor. Okay? Are we all good on that? Beautiful. I've never had problems with that, honestly. I'm just saying it as, what in French we call our acquis de conscience, just by consciousness, right? An awareness of the fact. Okay, just going through the syllabus, AI use. I don't care. I have to put this out of obligation, but just don't. It shows it's never that interesting. To be honest, I know some people use it to polish up their writing. I'd much prefer like a really weirdly syntaxed sentence than this over-polished and boring sentence. Right? It's so much more interesting to read. I get to see your thought process, and it's just much more engaging and human. Okay? Plus, it can't come up with ideas to save its life, so just don't. Okay? I say its life as if it has one. Anyway, that's a whole other question that we're not going to get into today. All right. Yeah, all that to say, please don't use it. It will not benefit you in any way, shape, or form. Yes. Oh, sorry, I thought you had to. All right. I can close the syllabus. Do you want to save the changes? No. Saving changes. Okay. Can close this. Beautiful. One of the things that I guess is a good place to start, right? Since I don't have the ability to show you the poems for today, is a bit of a talk on the actual theme of the class. Okay. Can I talk for a second about how massive this freaking things are? Genuinely. Why? Do orangutans teach here? They're with massive hands. I guess it's faster, but it's so cumbersome. That's such a city slicker thing to say. Like,
Yeah.
ew, cover some eraser.
Smart word.
Yeah, yes. Like, these are not farmers' hands, unfortunately. As my family keeps telling me over and over again. Okay. Self-deprecating humor aside, we do have, somewhat of a thought process to go through whenever we have a topic like contemporary literature, right? And I was thinking of this when I was walking to university from my rented place. Like, how do I articulate the question? Which is, when does now begin? Which sounds like something you would see in like an intro to philosophy class, right? Taught by a hack. But it is a genuine question, right? When you think about it, right? When does the contemporary moment, from a literary and cultural perspective, start, right? How do we identify that? Why would we identify it in that particular way? And the stakes of that question are rather important, mostly because it changes what we focus on thematically. It changes what we focus on politically, artistically, culturally, and so on. Okay? Because some people might say, the contemporary moment begins after World War II, right? When the Cold War begins and, suddenly our perspective of who our neighbors are, what politics are, and what art can do in that moment, right, completely changes, right? It becomes supercharged with that specific set of expectations about what it is to live in the world after World War II. Okay? Some people might say that. Some people might say, well, no, it's a bit weird to say post-World War II because, let's face it, none of us in this classroom have lived, that far in the past, right? So we don't really get that sense of what it was like to live in that moment, right? And so what impacts us as human beings and as people who are interested in literature and who produce literature or analyze literature, whatever you want to say, right, is much closer in time. Okay? Our fears and anxieties about those dirty communists and the atom bomb are just no longer true, right? For some. I say that as someone who's well aware of like the discourse that's happening in places like Alberta or the United States, right? That is still very much inflected by that kind of rhetoric, right? For good or bad, mostly bad. So when does now begin, right? And we can come back to that question. At the end of the day, it is very arbitrary, right? It's a bit of a disappointing answer, to say the least, but it's true, right? At some point, you do kind of have to make a cut. For me, when I think of contemporary literature, it's post-1970s. Okay? Why? Okay? Mostly because, in my estimation, and we're going to unpack this starting today, this is a moment when since, we'll say 1969, 1970, it's a bit, fluffy, we start to see a type of discourse around ecology that starts to play into the literature that's being produced, right, that we're still holding on to today, right? And it's this beginning of moving away from this romantic vision of ecology, right, that we were stuck with for so long and arguably are still kind of stuck with a little bit today, right? And we can kind of get to the romantics later. Arguably, like I said, post-1970s, we're still stuck with a politics that's still somewhat relevant to today, right? With the rise of neoconservatism or neoliberalism, right? That we're still holding on to today, right? we're seeing the rise of reckonings with history, right? Like the concept of history, what it means to write history, from all different kinds of perspectives that, again, is completely different from at any other point in time, right? And again, we don't need to say that these are necessarily good changes or bad changes, but they are changes that are happening in society and that have been continuing to happen since, I would say, the 70s. Right? And again, I'll kind of explain what I mean by that later, but this is just my opening spiel. What's interesting for us is that all of these changes are channeled through literature, right? Are visibly present in changes that happen in literature. If we go immediately post-World War II as the contemporary moment, as some people would have it, you're still very much within the modernist tradition, right? Your Ezra Pounds, your Virginia Woolfs, your T.S. Eliots, your other people from that time, okay? And this is true in Canada as well. The examples I just gave were British and American, but this is true in Canada, right? We have our E.J. Pratts and F.R. Scotts and Dorothy Livesays and so on and so forth that write in that tradition as well. And from the 70s, much like the modernists did with the romantics before them, right, we see the rise of what we would call postmodern, right, which is a very loaded term for some people, right? Some people hate it, some people think it's too broad, whatever, right? We can discuss that again later. But you see a distinct attempt to, again, try something new from a literary perspective that channels these historical and ecological and political into new forms of art. Did I lose anyone with that? Wow, really? Not a single yes. I'm going to pat myself on the back for that one. Okay. And like I said earlier, and as I mentioned in the email last week, part of the reason why I wanted you to read the poems that I gave you on Moodle was because I think they're rather emblematic of these changes. Okay. Jeannette Armstrong's history lesson was initially published in 1979. Okay. And would go through some revisions, but it was republished afterwards in a collection called Breath Tracks in the 90s, but originally in the 1970s. And the Nourbese Philip poem, Discourse on Language, it's an interminable name, Discourse on the Logic of Language, there you go, came out in 1982, if I remember correctly, like early 80s. Okay? So again, like these active playings with not just form, but content, right, is very much at the forefront of a lot of these writers' minds. For those of you who have been paying attention, I've just basically laid out what we're going to be doing for the next 12 classes. Okay. Each of these works that we're going to be analyzing and enjoying or hating, right? That's fine if you completely dislike some of the stuff. I'm not here to be the arbiter of taste, much as I would like to be. All of these works play with this in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes it's just one of these themes of history. Sometimes it's history and ecology. Sometimes it's what it means to write a novel, period. Right? That's when we get to Timothy Findley's The Wars. Right? It's a novel that came out in 1977, but that actively talks about World War I, but is also pluralized. Right? The wars, the S is important here. And it's also a novel that's not quite a novel in the sense that it talks about other forms of media that you wouldn't necessarily expect to have in a novel, like photography, for example. Okay? So that's just one example of how authors sometimes are actively playing with your expectations in a way that had never been done before. At least on such a scale, I should say. Before I bore you to tears, does anyone have any interventions that they would like to make or questions that they would like to ask about this? I know I've asked this quite a few times in this class, but because it's the first class, I'm still like getting people's pulses about like what I can say and how fast I can go with certain ideas. Okay. I should have maybe asked this before, but I know that some of you are not in the English program formally. Like, how many of you have taken English classes before, literature classes before? Oh, yikes, really? Like, none of you? Wow! You have. Okay, good. So I'm just saying terms left, right, and center as if they're completely assumed. This is blowing my mind. Wow, of all the times that you could have started to take a class, it was like a contemporary literature class in a summer course with a guy who just doesn't care about explaining things sometimes. Okay. I guess added caveat. If I use terms that are completely unfamiliar to you. I was talking earlier about like, oh, lineation and enjambment, as if it's the most normal term that I could use. Stop me and say, hey, Patrick, you don't need to call me professor or sir. You just say, hey, Patrick, time out. Back up. Explain enjambment to me like I'm a 5-year-old.
I mean, you said you were going to explain it later, so I just kind of put a pin in it.
I say a lot of things. So sometimes I will be actively explaining, like I say that jokingly, but yes, enjambment is relevant for the history lesson as a poem, so we will talk about it in a second. But sometimes, I don't think of explaining a certain concept, right, a literary or otherwise, so just please don't hesitate to ask. Okay? Much as I would like to present in front of people who are like supremely well versed in literary studies and the intricacies of it, evidently that is not the case, and that's okay. Okay, that's totally fine. I'm not saying that disparagingly. Okay, so we'll just adapt accordingly. So, pull up. Do we want to take a break or do we want to just keep going? Oh no. Okay. Take 5 minutes. Just stretch your legs. Okay, so shorter break than we would usually take. Just because I know I gave you a lot of information right now. So take like 5 minutes and then we'll come back. And we'll come back and read history lesson first. Okay. In the meantime, I'll try again to figure this bloody thing out. Come to me if you have any questions during the break as well.
Read a dissertation on Stardew.
I mean, for real.
Much as I would not want to interrupt a discussion on Starry Valley. Stardew Valley, I'm sorry. My sincerest apologies to the developers and players of. Okay. We will get started again. So, does everyone at least have access to their Moodle to have history lesson up in front of them? Good. I see enough heads nodding yes, that will be good. What I would like to do is actually, considering what I learned before the break, not only use this poem as an introduction to some of the themes of the class, but also just the basic idea of engaging with poetry, right? Because the obvious answer is simply read it, right? Yes. But how do we read poetry is actually a question that maybe too many people have spilled too much ink on, right? You can find endless supplies of books asking this question, right? How does one read poetry? What is the art of reading poetry? These are all real, book titles. And that's okay. So how do we actually read a poem? I would argue that the worst thing you can do for poetry is reading it alone, okay, and to yourself in your mind. Okay, this used to be taken as fact, by the way. So brief detour through a history lesson. Poet, right, literally used to be like a storyteller, right? So that when we were talking about, for example, the ancient Greeks were talking about Homer, the poet, right? They were literally referring to an orator, a speaker. Okay? And for most of the history of poetry, that was taken for fact that you would actually speak it out loud. Okay? There were two reasons for this. One, most people couldn't read. So it's a very practical reason why people actually read poetry out loud, right? So everyone could enjoy the benefits of beautiful lines, right? But also, because of the very nature of what it means to write poetry, and this is something that you should all keep in mind, right, is that poetry has a rhythm to it, right? Think of hip-hop, or basically any song, really, right? There is a difference, I think, between song and poetry. We can get into that later if we want. But the idea of actually constructing a piece of literature that is intended to have a specific rhythm and cadence to it is part and parcel for the actual enjoyment of the work. And that exists nowhere else, right, as far as literature is concerned. When you look at a novel, the first element is usually plot or character. Okay? When you look at theater, the first element is usually structure and form on a different level, like how it plays on the stage. Okay? That's why it's so weird to read Shakespeare, right? Because it wasn't meant to be read. Most of Shakespeare's plays weren't actually written down in his lifetime, right? So because they were meant to be there, seen, enjoyed as part of a crowd. Okay? Poetry is different. It is a little bit more personal, but it's still meant to be spoken out loud. This is true of poetry in general. And if you're a shy person, I'm sorry to say, but we will be reading poetry out loud in this class. I know that's a awful thing to say to people who are interested in English literature. We tend to be shy people, except me, of course, as you can probably see. But it's something also that in this period that we're talking about, the 70s and onward, certain groups of poets take extremely seriously, right, as a concept of being able to speak a poem. What does that actually imply, not only for you as a poet writing poetry, but also as someone who speaks the poem, right? How does that impact the actual enjoyment of it? Okay. I would keep that in mind, hint, hint, for tomorrow. The poets that I'm going to ask you to read for tomorrow, what we call broadly the Tisch poetry movement, and we'll come back to that, are very much concerned with this idea. So, how do we read a poem? We read it by starting at line 1, right? Obviously. Don't think about where to take a break, right? Don't think about what each individual word means just yet. That will come later. Okay? If anything, poetry is something that takes time. Okay? More than one reading, certainly. That's why I'm giving you so many poems to read in this class, is because you can actually read them more than once and still have time to actually come to class. Okay? And also because poetry is really cool. So what I recommend to students all the time, especially students who are new to the study of literature, is to read the poem once without thinking about it. if the poem is actually good, and I mean this like as a judgment, as a value judgment, right? If it's well constructed by the author, whoever they may be, the rhythm will kind of come naturally out of it. Okay? By the choice of words, where there's punctuation, and so on. Okay? And then, once you're finished just reading it for the vibes, I guess as the kids would say these days, then you can go back and individually deconstruct, right, what those individual words mean in relation to one another. Okay? It is a process, right? Like in the most basic sense of the term, right? It is something that does take time, but is extremely rewarding if you do it with passion. Okay? Because no poem was written just for a quick 5-minute read and then have it leave your mind forever. Okay? If the poem's well written, not only will you want to go back to it, but upon going back to it, you will discover things by the very choices of those words in relation to one another in a way that no other form of literature does. Okay? We're all good with that? That was my apology of poetry, I guess you would call it. Okay. Does anyone want to take a shot at reading the first stanza of History Lesson? You raised your hand. What's a stanza? When I say first stanza, what do I mean
Like
by
the
that?
first verse thing before there's a gap?
Good. So the first, to put it in layman's terms, the first paragraph, right, of the poem, that's a stanza. Okay, good. Yeah. So go for it and project your voice so that the entire class can hear it as if you're in front of a theater. And then someone else is going to pick up the next one, by the way. So go for it whenever you're ready.
Out of the belly of Christopher's ship, a mob bursts, running in all directions, pulling furs off animals, shooting buffalo, shooting each other, left and right. May I borrow you?
Sorry, I thought you had it.
Father mean well, waves his makeshift wand, forgives saucer-eyed Indians.
Red-coated knights scoured across the prairie to get their men and build a new world.
Good.
Pioneers and traders bring gifts, smallpox, seagrams, and rice krispies. Civilization has reached the promised land.
Okay. Yep, that was a fast one. Mark.
Between the snap, crackle, pop of smokestacks, the multicolored rivers swelling with flower-powered Z, are farmers sowing skulls and bones, and miners pulling from gaping holes green paper faces of a smiling English lady.
The colossi in which they trust while burying breathing forests and fields beneath concrete and steel stand, shaking fists, waiting to mutilate whole civilizations 10 generations at a blow.
Somewhere along the remains of skinless animals is the termination to a long journey and unholy search for the power glimpsed in a garden forever closed, forever lost.
I know full well that 4 people didn't read, but good for the people who did. Thank you. That was beautiful. I'll launch the question to the people who didn't read. What did you notice in the way that the poem was spoken? Just off the start, right? The way that it was said out loud, because everyone systematically had something to it, right? Even though it was different people, the poem had a certain quality to it. What was that quality? What did you notice in the reading of the poem? There are wrong answers, but as a pedagogue, I'll say there are no wrong answers. Just be free. What did you notice? If anything.
There's like no rhymes. Oh.
Good. Yeah. Awesome. No rhymes.
Yeah.
Not what you'd expect from poetry necessarily, right? We're taught in high school, poetry rhymes, right? No. Are you saying no because you didn't learn that in high school, or because you think that poetry doesn't rhyme?
No, I kind of did literature for a while. So
Okay. So you're the exception. That's true. You're the one who doesn't. For a lot of people, we tend to think that, at least from an early stages, right, poetry rhymes. And to be fair, some poetry does rhyme, right? You can read any John Dryden poem and it'll rhyme like no other poem you will ever read, right? That was like his thing. He managed to rhyme words that never should rhyme together, okay? No rhymes here.
Does the different way people express the poem kind of come in different verse?
Good. What do you mean? Say more.
Like some people are more enthusiastic towards the poem. I found it's like different readers, you could tell like different ways of looking.
Yeah. The individual speaker does absolutely have an impact on the poem. It has an impact on, and then I saw your hands. I didn't. It has an impact on certain elements, like where we put emphasis, right, on certain words, right. Much as we like to claim that there's a certain, they're what we call meter, right, in poetry, where certain words have to have a certain emphasis to it. In reality, because of the very nature of speech, we don't always put emphasis in the same places as human beings. Okay? But you'll notice that the rhythm still maintained itself, right, to a certain degree. So you're right. The speaker does matter, the actual speaker of the poem, right, who says it. But I should say the reader, because the speaker is basically the narrator of the poem. But the actual reader of the poem has an impact, only to a certain extent, though. The poem will guide you in many ways. Before I go to your hands, who said that it rhyme? Yeah, you did. Quick asterisk. There you go. Does anyone know what we call that when a poem doesn't rhyme? There's a term for that. It's called free verse, by the way. Okay. It will not be on the test, but just for your general edification, that's what we call a poem that does not rhyme. Okay. You had your hand up. Remind me your name. Ibule, good.
It had a lot of words, like a lot of action words.
Mm-hmm. Can you give me some examples?
Like it had running in all the directions, pulling or shooting, waves, forgives, like it had
mean. Yeah. Good. Right? A lot of action verbs. We're going beyond the simple to be, right? Although famously to be can be a very powerful verb to use, right, in certain contexts. Thinking of Hamlet. But right, why does it matter that there's a lot of action verbs like that? Why would that choice matter? You're right. What impact does that have? Oh, go ahead.
Kind of like tells us like what the order is like.
Inevitably, yeah, the author is trying to convey something, but what is the author trying to convey? That's your role as a literary scholar, is to parse that out. You had your hand up.
I was just going to say there's a lot of activity because I got this kind of idea of colonizers just kind of like swarming over the continent like ants.
Good. Out of the belly of Christopher's ship, a mob bursts. It's not out of the belly of Christopher's ship. A few dandy men walk joyously through the prairies and are happy, and everyone sings hand in hand down the alleyway, right? That would be a completely different poem. Maybe a poem that you could creatively rewrite if you wanted to, but a completely different poem nonetheless, right? The choice of bursts, shooting, pulling, running. Not only are these action verbs, they're action verbs that you can imagine sudden movements associated to, right? When you pull a door, usually you don't do it gently, right? You pull the door so that it actually opens, right? It's a sudden move, generally speaking. I'm using a simple example here because I have a door right in front of me, but you get what I mean.
Plosive it is too. Bursts and pulls.
Good. You had your hand up.
I guess going off of that one too, it's like
Mhm.
trying to convey a sense of like urgency and aggression, and then hopping back to how in the different perspectives of who was reading it, it was kind of like that's where it kind of helps to know it's an indigenous author, right? Like you know that it's supposed to be read in like a saddening way almost because like their land's being taken by the colonizers. It's not supposed to be read in like a happy look who the colonizers are here way.
Good. Okay. So yeah, kind of putting those two together, I think on the level of form, right, the actual choice of words adds to that theme that you're talking about of explosive action, right, invasion, and so on, right? And what you were saying, the kind of explosive quality of the terms that are chosen, the use of p sounds, sh, bursts, right? All of these words that you have to expel some air out of your mouth in order to say. Okay? And before anyone says, perhaps you're overreading this, no. There is such a thing as overreading, right? But when multiple people read different parts of the poem and that same thing happens over and over again, you kind of know that you're not overreading. Okay? If you want a really good example of this, I would invite you to also read poems like Anthem for a Doomed Youth by Wilfred Owen, who was a World War I poet who died in World War I, actually, but was also one of those people who was a poet who died before his time. And his way of expressing the sounds of machine gun fire through the actual choice of words is a really good example of another poet who does exactly what Armstrong is doing here. Okay? Ash, you had your hand up, and then you... Brittany had your hand up as well.
No, she set the point, but I was going to say it's very violent. I imagine like gunshots, like you referenced.
Good.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously with the shooting, right, you inevitably imagine gunshots, right? But shooting can mean all kinds of things. You can shoot a bow, right? You can shoot a slingshot, right? But you're right. I think it's the B and the P sounds that add to that imagination of the bullets more than maybe an F sound might invoke an arrow being shot, for example. And also because we know for a fact that Europeans had gun technology, so I think we instinctively kind of associate it with that as well, right? Brittany, go for it.
I thought maybe there was a bit of sarcasm in it. Like the pioneers and traders bring gifts, the smallpox.
Mm-hmm. Good. Smallpox, which first time I read it, I was like, oh, you may maybe have a pun on like a small box, right? Smallpox. Haha. Seagrams. What's Seagrams? Is it?
Whiskey, isn't it?
Yeah, it's whiskey. Yeah, that's right. Sorry. I was thinking of something else, but yes, it is whiskey. Yeah. And Rice Krispies, right? So the Rice Krispies, I think Rice Krispies, adds to your point, Brittany, of it being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, right? Rice Krispies is a bit of a, if you got it as a gift for Christmas, I think you'd be like, all right, it's nice. I like Rice Krispies like the next person, but it's not like what you'd expect as a gift necessarily, right? And especially not smallpox and Seagrams. Right? Yes.
The Rice Krispies bit, I thought she was talking about the indigenous foodways being lost and all the like processed crap that they were given instead.
Good. Yeah. I wasn't going to bring it up necessarily because it might like get us away from like too much from the poem, but yes, I think that's absolutely at the front of Armstrong's mind. If you just to amplify what was just said, one of the things that is still present in a lot of Indigenous reservations here in Canada is what we call broadly food deserts, right? A flagrant lack of healthy foods, right? This is not simply in Indigenous reservations, I might add. A lot of poor neighborhoods, both historic and current, have also faced similar situations. in part because of deliberate attempts to kind of isolate certain people, but also because of like historical economic shifts that happen that tend to leave poorer or marginalized communities with access to less healthy food. And this is true everywhere. Like, I will take my example of Montreal. There are clear areas that have food deserts in them, right? And Montreal is not like an indigenous reservation. But I think you're absolutely right that a lot of places do have a flagrant lack of that, and therefore rely on things like Rice Krispies. Yeah, good. Yes, and then
Yeah,
Ash.
about Rice Krispies. This was written in the 70s.
Yeah.
Was Rice Krispies like
Yes, it was a thing. Like the Rice Krispies thing. Yeah.
the thing?
The cereal?
Like this thing?
Not Rice Krispies. I don't know about Rice Krispies bars, but the cereal of Rice Krispies did exist in the 70s. Yeah. Yeah. And that's why she references 2 stanzas down between the snap, crackle, and pop, right? Echoing the famous ad campaign that's still around today. I don't know. I have not eaten Rice Krispies in 25 years. Yeah. So that's something again, and then I will come back to your hand, Ash. Just because I'm thinking of it with the Rice Krispies and the snap, crackle, and pop, what you can pay attention to whenever you read poetry like this, or just any poetry, is how a theme carries from one stanza to another. Okay? As a general rule, whenever we read in English, usually meaning is made based off of the word that immediately precedes and immediately follows, right? Just take any novel, right? A word doesn't make any sense usually in isolation. It only exists in relation to the word immediately after. But one of the beauties of poetry is that you can jump meanings across lines. Okay? Hence why she can go from Rice Krispies to civilizational promise to snap, crackle, and pop, right? Your mind kind of jumps those lines with the poet. Okay. I'm condensing like what could be a literary analysis class, like an intro to lit class in 2 lines, but that's basically the gist of it, right? You had your hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Where I'm from, I come from Reserve Way up north.
Good.
A bag of apples is like $20.
Yeah.
And so I imagine back in, our author's day, Rice Krispies could almost be seen as a treat, because I know a lot of our community's elders didn't have access to commercial goods.
Yeah.
So it kind of goes hand in hand of, yes, it is poverty food, but at one point people really saw it as a treat.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, it's like what Mel said earlier about, just commercialization of everything, the capitalization, just making everyone poor.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Armstrong is so I'll amplify again what was just said for people in the back, but Armstrong is not particularly happy about the current capitalist system that she's living in, and I think a lot of that comes through, right? She's tracing those historical roots not only of colonialism, but of capitalism. And I think you're absolutely right that the marketing of food, right, is an important part of what she's going for in this case, right? What should be a basic food item, literally rice, which is a basic food item for so many people across the world, right? Billions of people rely on rice, including, by the way, indigenous peoples before colonizers arrived, right? Wild rice is a thing here as elsewhere, right? Billions of people rely on this like basic food element in the same way that billions relied on bread, right, for so long and still do, right? Try living without bread for like half a day, right? I know I couldn't. Bread is awesome, right? But to then turn it into like this weird byproduct that is sold to children and filled with addictive sugar is a devastating thing to do to any food product, especially a basic food item like rice. Okay. Which is, I think, why she includes that stanza about civilization and progress in the middle of Rice Krispies and then Snap, Crackle, and Pop. She's kind of making that bridge of the promises of civilization, right? We're bringing all of these beautiful products, right, and consumer choice to the masses. And, well, most of it sucks. Like, let's be honest. And I think we all know that deep down, but at the end of the day, also, Rice Krispies fucking rock. And so we still eat it, right? I shouldn't swear in class. I'm sorry. Right. These are all really good points. I like this, right? You're all really good. If you keep this energy up for the next 12 classes, you'll all make it, by the way. Okay, let me just... So, obviously, the historical part that I mentioned at the start of class is front and center. Okay, in this one, by the very title of the poem, which, Mel, when you started off, you didn't read, but that's okay. Right? As a general rule, this is not a criticism of you. Your reading was really good. As a general rule, people also include the title in a reading of a poem. Right? Even the poets themselves will read their own title before reading it. Just for people's information. So the historical element is front and center, and that's the one that a lot of you focused on. The ecological element, while we didn't address it in depth, and I saw your hand mark, can be really expanded on as far as the rice is concerned that we just discussed. There's a pretty hefty ecological reading that you can have of this, but also breathing forests and fields beneath concrete and steel, shaking fists, waiting to mutilate whole civilizations 10 generations at a blow is a hauntingly prescient ecological statement as well. Okay. Yes, you had your hand up.
I just kept looking at it and looking at the structure of the poem and the stanzas, and I noticed some of them are shorter, and I know you mentioned this term earlier. Maybe this is one thing I know about poetry lineation is the structure of the sentences or the lines, right? So I kept thinking the shorter ones were more important, maybe. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I kind of kept looking at the shorter ones because I feel like they're more pronounced.
So lineation is a good term to bring up. So what Mark was talking about, fancy way of saying the length of lines. Okay. We'll come back to that. I brought up enjambment earlier. That is where the line ends, right? When we go from one line to another. Okay? So the two are inevitably connected. Okay. So usually, an enjambment happens after a punctuation mark, right? You'll notice this in a lot of traditional poetry. There's a line, and then a comma at the end. Next line, maybe a dash, right? Another line, period. Okay. And it tells you, where to stop, what kind of breaks to take. Okay. There's barely any punctuation in this. There is one.
There's one comma.
There's one comma. After smallpox. I think it's exactly in the middle of the poem. No, wouldn't be exactly in the middle, but almost in the middle of the poem. Again, we're talking about intention here. Okay. Armstrong, by the 70s, was already a professional poet. Right? She knew how to write poetry. Say she knew. Is she dead? I don't know. I'd have to look this up. So that choice of a comma, right, is not random. And I'll come back to the length here. but also her choice of not including any punctuation and just basically letting the reader decide where to take those breaks is also an interesting choice as well from a speech perspective. Okay? Because most people will take a brief break at the end of a line, whether there's punctuation or not. But technically, you don't have to. Out of the belly of Christopher's ship, a mob bursts, running in all directions, pulling furs off of animals, shooting buffalo, shooting each other, left and right. I could read it like that without any breaks. Out of the belly of Christopher's ship, a mob bursts, running in all directions, pulling furs off of animals, shooting buffalo, shooting each other, left and right. Completely different vibe. Same technical meaning of each of those words changes the weight of that poem entirely. So, see a line break here. This comes back to Mark's point about lineation, because that also has an impact, you're absolutely right, on how we perceive the meaning of a line. Okay? As a general rule, longer lines, if you want to use a completely unpoetic term, so longer, it's more of a cool poem. And I mean this not in the sense of like the line has sunglasses on it and it smokes cigarettes like a cool person, right? I shouldn't say that. Smoking is not cool. But you know what I mean, right? It's the James Dean of lines. There's a reference for no one. But that's not what I mean, right? I mean cool in the sense of like, imagine literal coolness, right? The lack of heat. You're not burning yourself off the line. It's lulling you in a sense. Okay? You're more aware of it. Whereas a short line, this comes back to your excellent point, right? Complete opposite. Very hot. It's like touching a burner.
Just to add on to that short being hot, the one that stands out the most to me is that civilization has reached promised land. I feel like that one's supposed to be said with a lot of you gotta say that one civilization has reached the promised land with that sarcastic kind of theme that we talked about earlier.
Good. Right? Very short line, and there's almost not only sarcasm in the actual theme, but has reached the promised land, right? We're establishing a civilizational peak, this highest form, supposedly, of civilization, and we're expressing it in this short burst that's meant to be impactful, right? And immediately moving on. So yes, it's not overreading to pay attention to that lineation. Right? Ash, did you have your hand up?
No, I was just...
Okay. Remind me your name.
Lee.
Lee.
Sorry, I just wanted to confirm one thing.
Please.
With regards to the word ecological, when we're referring to that in this context, we're talking about the study of the relationship between humans and physical environment.
So, one of the interesting things, broadly speaking, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Now I can go on my tangent for the next 15 minutes. One of the interesting things I think about contemporary literature is that you'll notice, especially starting tomorrow, that more and more poets are no longer even that interested in the human element of what you just said, right? Because that's the romantic view, is my human imposition or perception, not necessarily imposition, but perception of this natural world that I am mediating through my poetic genius because I'm Wordsworth and I can do that. Right? It's all about how how nature impacts me. Yes, it's about that relation, right? But ultimately it's about me, right? Because romantics are nothing if not self-centered. And I say that with the utmost respect. I love Coleridge. I love Wordsworth. They're great, right? Charlotte Smith, absolutely incredible. But that's a lot of that poetry, right, or that style of writing. Jane Austen does this as well, by the way, right, in her ecological passages, few as they may be. But it's all about the personal relation to nature, right? Oh my God, this tree is so amazing. What does this say about my place in the universe if I can't even comprehend the magnificence of this tree? I'm barely exaggerating, by the way. Like, there are poems that are actually that, and they're wonderful. Much better than I'm making them out to be. Okay? And what you'll notice is that a lot of contemporary poetry starts to move away from that. Okay? And I think, to come back to your point, lady, what some of this poem is doing is at least indicating on some level, right, that these perceptions of our relation to nature are rooted in a particular moment in time, right? Whether we are on board with those perceptions or not, Indigenous communities had a vision of, ecology that was different from Europeans, and Europeans had a different vision of ecology from Asian communities and African communities, and so on and so forth, right? People have different, perceptions of the world around them. That's not a new statement, right? But the one that we're stuck with, right, where we, skin animals, pull fur off of animals, and shoot buffaloes, and generally exploit the world around us for capital gain, right? For all the prosperity that it has brought us, is rooted in a specific moment in history. That's the ecological component happening here. I still didn't lose anyone? You're going to be a great class. Yes.
I always think, when I think of the Romantics, I think it's even maybe on the Wikipedia page, so I might be here, but that painting of the guy looking over the mountains.
Yeah.
It just, captures it.
You've all seen that painting? Okay, so you can look it up, yeah, if you look up Romantic Sublime on your computer, you'll probably see it. Is this guy in a black coat, right? Kind of a Mr. Darcy looking person, right? Who's looking out faceless over this incredible landscape, right? Beautiful painting, right? But what is centered is that guy, right? It doesn't matter that he doesn't have a face, right? We don't even know who he is. It's irrelevant. What matters is that it is the individual literally on top of a mountain, supreme above this world, and he's saying, wow, what a beautiful world that I can contemplate. Right? I can make sense of it. I alone am the arbiter of nature. And that's awesome. Awesome in the most literal sense of awe-inspiring. If you want a good example of that painting in poetry, you can look at Shelley's Mont Blanc. You know exactly what poem I'm talking about?
No, but I know Shelley.
Right, you know Shelley. The husband of what is now the more famous, who is now the more famous Shelley, Mary Shelley, right? Percy at the time was more popular, and he wrote an incredible poem called Mont Blanc. It's all about this mountain, the Chamonix mountain in France, right, that he hiked up. And he has this weird deep time experience, right? Just contemplating how infinitely ageless this mountain is. And the very last line of the poem almost undercuts the entire thing, because he's like, would this mountain still exist if I weren't there to see it? Completely screws the pooch on it, right? From a contemporary perspective. But that's the Romantic project. And we're moving away from this. I spent more time on the Romantics than I planned on. That's always the case. Always come back to the Romantics. If you don't mention the Romantics once a day, that should be it. A Romantic a day will keep the doctor away. I haven't been to the doctor in 7 years, And it's because I mentioned Blake or Shelley every day. That's such a stupid thing to say. Okay. Any final things that we want to mention about a history lesson?
Like the poem itself.
Yeah, the poem itself, sure.
Am I dumb?
Okay, no, you're not dumb. Look, okay, no, I will say this: never be say that you're dumb for asking like what a word means, especially for poetry. Okay, for a novel maybe, but but for poetry specifically, because part of what's interesting about poetry is a lot of poets want to express something that has never been expressed before, right? And that's why some people are frustrated by this, but the poets tend to use more elevated language, right? Or to make these comparisons that wouldn't usually come to mind. Like, I read a poem the other day called Chrysanthemum, and it used the word chrysanthemum faces, like the flower. And it just stopped me because I was like, what the hell does that even mean? But that's the beauty of it, right? I know what a chrysanthemum is. I know what a face is. But what does a chrysanthemum face mean? So never consider yourself stupid. So Colossi is the plural of Colossus, the giant, basically. Yeah, is what it means. So Colossus is a mythical creature, right? That would have basically been a giant. Yeah. So
Almost like the giants in which they trust.
Yes. The last point I want to make, and that I think we're not going to go into as much depth as I wanted to, because I think the poem itself doesn't really lend itself to that when I don't have the visuals of it. But I do think it does lead us into the Nourbese Phillips quite well, this last point that I want to make. But it's the very first one that we brought up in relation to history lesson, which is that there is no rhyme to it. Okay. Pop quiz. What's no rhyme? What's the term? Free?
Free word.
Free verse.
Sorry.
Good.
Thank you.
Good. So I know you're listening. Awesome. But yeah, free verse. So part of why that's such an important point to make in this case is, again, it's a very easy example, along with Mark's line of lineation, that a big part of what contemporary poets do is really abandon deliberately, right, almost to the point of it being its own form, any kind of established form, right? The lack of form is form, right, if you want to put it in that kind of weirdly redundant or circular way. Where a lot of poetry, even the modernists, right, tended to at least consciously play with elements of form, right? Like they knew what the specific expectations of poetry were, right? Or the specific expectations of novels were. A lot of the contemporary writers that we're going to see don't even take that into consideration as much anymore. And that kind of enters into a lot of what we're going to be discussing on a thematic level. Because why would Armstrong, and I see your hands, I've probably said something that just kind of went completely over people's head, and that's okay. We should wonder, like, why Armstrong specifically as an Indigenous person is hell-bent on not adopting a specific type of form. Okay, I'll come back to that question in a second. Mel, and then Lee.
I was just thinking about Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. I don't know if you've read any Sally Rooney, but
I have, but not that one.
There's a character who is a poet, and she's writing a poem for publishing, and she says she writes the poem, and then she just breaks it up randomly. Like, she's giving no thought at all to it.
Good.
And I think it was just like a tongue-in-cheek way.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. And on a literal level, this is, it's next week, I think, that we're doing Michael Ondaatje, The Collected Works of Billy the Kid, or at least an excerpt of it, because it's a longer book, but parts of it. And I'll repeat this next week, but that's literally something that he admits to have done with that work, is put out the poems or elements of poems on his floor and play around with where each word goes, right? Again, coming back to what creates the best rhythm and cadence rather than form itself, right? Yes, Lee.
Thematic. What is it?
It's the adjective of themes.
Just okay, so just fancy way of saying the theme of it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. No, it's fine. Yeah, go ahead, Ash.
I'm sorry.
No, never apologize for asking questions. We're here to learn. Go.
Oh no, I just said sorry because I almost forgot to ask. Do you think her way of writing is a form of nonconformity?
Okay, good. Thank you for forcing me back into that question that I asked earlier. Yeah, so. Okay. Literally, conformity. This is like the most basic element of linguistics 101, right? It's included in conformity includes the word form. Okay? In the most literal sense, right? So that when a poet wants to write a sonnet, okay, it has to respect a certain form, right? So a sonnet, I'm running out of space already. A sonnet has to have two quatrains, which is a fancy way of saying 4 lines in a stanza. 2 quatrains, and a couplet. 2 rhymed lines. Each of those lines has to be in iambic pentameter, which is 5 stressed, unstressed feet. We can go on and on forever. It doesn't matter, right, for our purposes here. I'm using it as an example to say that if you want to write a love poem, right, which a sonnet is supposed to be, generally, it has to respect a certain look, right? The words that you choose have to fit within that pattern that's been used for like 600 years at this point. In English, at least. 900 if we include the Italians. Okay? Which is, on the one hand, really great. Why? Because it means that you can flex your poetic chops. If you can write a sonnet in a way that no one else in that 500 years of sonnet writing history has ever done, you are an incredible poet. Because you managed to put words in an order and in a way that still fits this box, right? This poetic box that still manages to blow people's minds 500 years on. Okay? On a technical level, awesome, if you can manage to do that. On a literal level, it is also limiting in certain ways. Okay? And to come back to your point, I think you're absolutely right, Ash, in saying that Armstrong is deliberately going against these types of boxes. Which comes back to the question of why.
If she put herself into, I would assume that's a Eurocentric box. If she put herself into that box, then she would be the same as this. She's clapping back against that.
Good. This is a history of colonization that you may or may not know, but like part of the colonial project was also imposing certain cultural standards, right? While I think it diminishes the horror of that statement, that's where a lot of people come into the historical conversation of the residential schools by saying that it was quote unquote cultural genocide. No, it was actual genocide, but the basic idea of calling it cultural genocide also stems from the fact that the colonial project wanted to impose a certain cultural standard while also killing people. Okay. Is that where you were going to add?
I was going to say it might have been so cathartic for her
Mhm.
because, I don't know how old she is, but she said she was very prevalent in the 70s.
Mhm.
I remember. There's a very good chance she went to residential school.
Oh,
and
yeah.
within those schools, you would get
Mhm.
beaten for not writing good English or not using proper punctuation. So I imagine this form of writing could have been very cathartic for her.
Yes. Now, so first of all, to answer that question that no one asked, Armstrong is still alive, so that's good. I don't know if she went to a residential school, but she still would have been of that age where she could have, right? Because the last residential school in Canada closed when I was still alive. So, way too late. Okay? 1997, for people who are wondering, right? When the last one closed. And unfortunately, I'm older than that. But yes, so on the one hand, it's cathartic, right? To break from those culturally imposed norms, right? Some authors also deliberately play with those forms, right? Armstrong's not really interested, it seems, in that, right? She's just kind of belying it completely, right? And I think that kind of ties back to the Columbus ship bursting out, right? That would be pushing it, but it works as a metaphor in this case of Columbus's ship being the imposed form and it's bursting out in some ways, right? She's kind of setting out her project. That is a metaphorical fancy that I'm using here, not actual literary analysis, because there's nothing in the poem that actually would indicate that on a textual level. You good?
Yeah.
Okay. But just to give a quick example here, Thompson Highway is another Indigenous author who some of you might have read before. He's written novels, operas, musicals, kind of all kinds of things. But he very much plays within those European modes, right? Deliberately so. And he is someone who went to residential schools. And to go off of your point, Ash, he's someone who actually has gotten a little bit of flack from some of his peers because he credits residential schools for having taught him his trade, right? He is kind of an outlier in the sense of having had an actual education in the residential schools, right? That's where he learned to play the piano and speak English, right, and so on and so forth. So some Indigenous authors also do play with, the actual limitations of that form and see where it takes them. Okay. Yes.
Just to kind of ask about poetry and stuff like this, especially in the 70s, 60s, wasn't it kind of just like a time where they were just trying to break the molds and just doing their own thing and creating new ways of doing poetry?
Yeah. The most famous examples, I think, that we still know today are the beat poets, right? Some of you may have heard of Allen Ginsberg, that kind of person. I have my own issues with the beat poets, just on a personal appreciation level, because I don't think there's much of a philosophy behind it other than just doing things, right? And as we'll see, whether it's with people like Armstrong or the Tish poets tomorrow, there is still a philosophy behind why they're playing with the form so flagrantly, where I don't necessarily get that sense as much with the beat poet. So it really goes from one movement to another. It really changes from one movement to another. But you're right, Mark, that this is very much a time in the 60s and 70s where a lot of people are playing with this, right? Just to come back to Ginsberg, his whole, I think he had a whole poem that was just letters. It was just a scream, awful shit, just terrible. It's not poetry. It's just a word salad in the most literal sense.
Like
But maybe that's
Yoko Ono. Something like
yeah, exactly like you own. Yeah. No, I'm not going to go down the Yoko Ono path. See, this always happens. I get really excited from your responses, and then I spend an hour on a certain poem. I assigned you like 5 poems next week. How many do you think, for tomorrow, how many do you think we're actually going to get to? Who's to say? That's kind of the fun of literature classes. You just kind of go on tangents like that and see where it takes you.
Well, we won't have the boring bit at the beginning tomorrow, so.
That is true. We won't have the boring bit. So maybe we'll get to 3 poems. Maybe. By the way, tangent time. Even if we do not talk about a specific poem in class, for whatever reason, maybe we got like really hung up on one specific poem, you can still talk about it in your essays, and there probably won't be a question about it in the exam because it would be a bit unfair to you, but like in your essays, and if you still wanted to, bring it up for whatever reason, feel free, right? Like that's, I think, a fair thing to say. Okay, now is there anything that we need that we want to finish off with history lesson? I'm glad that people got so much out of it, genuinely. Yes.
This is really a callback,
No,
but
please.
I'm really stuck in my brain on this comma in the middle of the poem.
Oh, good.
Like the beginning half of the poem is all like the lead up, what they wanted, what they were doing, and then the results. And I didn't even notice the comma, but it's like a hinge in the middle of the poem.
Yep. You said it. That's great. I completely forgot that we had talked about the comma, but yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to say about it was, yeah, it's a hinge, right? In the most like visual sense, right? Of the turning point, right? That which allows something to move from one direction into another. Which sometimes is the job of enjambment, depending on the poet. Sometimes it's the job of a comma. Sometimes it's the job of that gap between the stanzas. Okay? That empty space that may or may not mean anything. Right? A lot of poets use it to change speakers, right? To change voices, to change perspectives. Okay? So, yes, again, pay attention. Even to a simple word, there is no, that word doesn't exist in this poem, but even a simple word like but, right, is such a powerful word in poetry. And you should always pay attention to it if you see but. 1 T, by the way, I should mention. Haha, facile humor. Ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba, I'm 12. But seriously, but also operates as a word of as a hinge word, right? It can shift perspectives and themes much in the same way as the comma is shifting on the literal level of the line, the theme of the poem. Because we go from smallpox, right? Something that is brought, comma, Seagrams, right? Abstract to physical result, right? The disease that's brought by colonialism, the European colonials who brought smallpox, and the impact of alcoholism that still continues today in many indigenous communities. Right? So on the literal level of that line, there's that hinge. And then you bring it out, you expand it outward, and you're right that that first half is pretty much the history lesson. And the second half of that history lesson is the legacy, if you will. Damn, that's good. The power of a comma. If any English teacher berates you about a comma, now you know why. Right? It can literally change everything. That's maybe stretching it a bit. All right. I'm going to force us out of out of history lesson. Can you turn? We're not going to spend as much time on discourse, in part because of just technical difficulties. But if you can pull it up on your phone or whatever. I'll give you a second if you don't have it in front of you. And I'm running out of water, and I should have gotten some during our break.
I think the water bottle thing is just right around the corner.
I mentioned my romantics, so I'm going to be fine for the rest of the day without water. Just like it just powers you through. Okay. How do you read a poem like this? Discourse on the Logic of Language. So for those of you who don't have it in front of you, I will give you a quick kind of look. Looks like this. What is this? Is this a poem? Yes. No. Is it like a meditation? Is it just Nourbese Philip pulling our leg and being like, haha, I can put whatever on the page and you will interpret it as poetry because you're all a bunch of nerds? Maybe. How do you read something like this?
It's like a collage.
Good. So first of all, it's like a collage. That's a good way of putting it. I'm not going to write it down. You all know what the word collage means.
Very artistic.
It's artistic. Good. Right? And this you saw a little bit with the modernists that I mentioned earlier, right? Playing with what a poem actually looks like. Gertrude Stein did a lot of this. Okay? Where she would actively play with the visuals of the poems, right? Where she would have a poem that would start with a line that's long and then get progressively shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter until she had like an upside down triangle, and that's cool.
Like Shel Silverstein.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good example. So is there a specific place where we begin? Does the beginning matter? Might be also another question that we can ask ourselves. Looking at a poem like this, what's your first instinct? Where would you begin, genuinely?
English is my mother tongue.
Why? Okay, good. It's the dead center, right? Like, inevitably your eye goes for it.
It's not sideways.
It's not sideways. Oh, who wants to turn a book sideways? Right? Like, the horror.
I kind of got the impression...
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Melanie, whoever was talking.
I kind of got the impression that she was sort of inviting us to choose our own adventure, like read it however you want to, start wherever you want to.
Yeah, I like that. Good. Who else was speaking after? So someone was starting to say something. Yeah, go ahead, Brittany.
I don't remember what it was.
Okay. Okay, so the choose your own adventure is really good. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry.
No,
I
fine.
think it's because you can see that it's broken up into stems. Or the other part of the page looks like paragraphs, like something you should read after.
Okay, right. So inevitably, right, because we're reading English in this case, recognizable English, we tend to read from right to left. Left to right, sorry. I know my left and right. Oh. Right, so from left to right. Okay, so these are all really good answers. Now pay attention to the title. I mentioned the title earlier is always something that's really important to bring up. What does the title tell us about how each of your responses is not random? Mm-hmm.
It's literally about the logic of language. Like it's about, as you said, you read left, right. That's part of the logic of language.
Language is also its own restriction in many ways. And granted, I'm saying like good, because it allows us to communicate and have like a common tongue in some ways, right? Like I can say things and you will all grasp that meaning. Okay. So on some level that's good. Okay. But your confusion with this poem also belies how some of those structures are sometimes, again, just taken for granted. Because as soon as something kind of plays with that structure or plays with that look, suddenly everyone loses their minds, right? To quote that awful movie. Yeah.
I have a question though. Like because I read this out thing like 2 times.
Yeah, good.
I couldn't understand what was like. It was really confusing to me.
Mm-hmm.
And like I just went through it again, and I still can't like grasp it. It's like repeating the same words, but still confusing.
Yeah, good.
Did you would you? What is the right way to read it? Because I first assumed you read the sideways stuff.
I don't think there is a way to read it.
No.
I think that's the point that she's going for. You could read.
I felt like I understood the sideways parts more when I read the other parts first.
Yeah, but no matter where you start, you'll be missing a bit of the overall work, right? So if I start on the right-hand side, those parts of the brain chiefly responsible for speech are named after 2 learned 19th century doctors, the eponymous doctors Wernicke and Broca, respectively. Not really a poem, it's just prose. Okay? Why is she talking about 19th century doctors, though? Like, what does that have to do? Like, I'm not actually asking that necessarily. Like, you can answer in a second, but I'm asking it rhetorically now because as an example of no matter where you begin, you'll have questions, right? Go ahead, Nell, and then... I'm sorry? Okay, I'll go ahead. Yeah.
I thought she was talking about the armchair anthropologists and their hierarchy of beings.
Yeah, good. So we find that out a little bit later, right, when she talks about slavery, right, in Edict 1, right? And then when we bring in the title of, like, logic of language, we imagine, like, a certain type of structure. And especially in the 19th century, you're right, there were a lot of what we would now call pseudo-scientists, right? Coming up with all kinds of, like, the wackest theories about language and evolutionary quote-unquote theory and, race. That was basically a way of saying, like, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant is the greatest, achievement of civilizational history with our bland food. Yeah. It's a bad joke, but whatever. Right? But regardless, like that discourse, to use the term of the title, right, is something that still seeps into how we understand and process the world around us. Right? Again, it comes down to this, what I was saying about sonnets. When I was talking about sonnets, I was talking about it on the level of poetic form. Right? And again, I'm not saying that like entirely critically. Like I love sonnets, like the next person, right? But it does come with its own baggage, right? I like that I can communicate to you with a specific type of like structure, but the reason why we use that structure also comes with its own baggage. And that is, I think, is what she's getting at. Yes, you've had your hand up for long enough. Go for it.
The poem is very confusing. It's all over the place, and that kind of feels like learning a new language. I would say.
Like, that's good.
It's breaking it down, language, anguish, and then like coming up with different observations of like similar words.
Good.
And then there's a kind of maybe more cohesive one on the other side, which might come more naturally.
Yeah. And that comes back to what Nourbese, what you were saying before about it being confusing, right? And the repetition. There's repetition of terms in the poem, but none of them, they're not quite the same, right? I'm just looking at the middle one. What is my mother tongue? My mammy tongue, my mummy tongue, my mumsy tongue, my mudder tongue, my ma tongue, right? All of these are technically the same word, right, of mother, right, but in different dialects, right? I personally would use something like, actually none of them, I tend to use mum, right, on its own, okay? But I know my own mother would say mumsy, right? Like just within the same culture, there are different ways of expressing that same word, right? And again, it comes with a certain kind of baggage to it, right? This is not me dunking on the way that my mom speaks, by the way. But it is just a good example. Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to do here, and I won't do it because my computer speaker sucks, but there is a recording that I'll put up on Moodle so that if you want to listen to it, you can. But there is a recording of Philip reading this poem herself. So it can give you a sense of how she understands that poem. But she basically reads section by section, right? But that gets, again, and then I saw your hand, at something that I brought up at the beginning of class, right? Of this idea of how we read poetry, right, on the most literal level. And you'll recall that I started that lecture section by saying that one of the assumptions for hundreds, if not thousands of years, was that poetry was spoken out loud. And what you're starting to see with the contemporary moment is, yes, the ability to still say this out loud. There is a rhythm to what Philip wrote, but she's also playing with how we literally engage with it on a material and textual level. Okay? The part of the experience of the poem is opening up a book and seeing it printed as it is there. Okay? Which, to the credit of contemporary works, is an ability that writers since the 70s have had an unparalleled ability to do. Right? Even immediately after World War II, there were still things like paper rations for a long time, for example. Prior to World War II, not everyone could read, or print was limited, to say the least. Right? It's really like the advent of mass-produced books, right? Like the literal mass paperback editions that we know and love, that fall apart after 2 years, that we can play with how a poem is actually printed on the page. Again, keep this in mind for future classes. This will come back tomorrow and next week. Yeah. Actually, even, week 3 as well. Not week 3, class 3, with Hashidik. Pay attention to what is printed, even though it's a theater play. I'll remind you of this. Yes, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and stanza 4 and 5.
Of which part? The middle part.
The straight one, the one that you would normally go to. Mm-hmm. Basically, what do you think she was doing here? Because she goes, I have no mother tongue, and no mother to tongue, then no tongue to mother tongue.
Good. So, I think part of this, so the first line is the one that we would have the most meaning to ascribe to, right? I have no mother tongue. For context, and Nourbese Philip is black, in case you didn't look her up or didn't care. So that's why it's important for her to talk about the slavery element and that whole legacy, right? And why it's important for her to maybe wonder what is the concept of mother tongue, right? And what it actually means, right? Because, shocker, right? A lot of Africans who were taken, right, as slaves did not speak English when they first were taken from the coast, right? So that mother tongue, quote unquote, is also an imposition. Right? As for the rest of that stanza, personally, how I read it is just her having fun, quote unquote, playing with that notion of what you can do with three simple words, right? And at first, it still has some meaning to it, right? No mother to tongue, maybe a poetic way of saying, like, to kiss, for example, right? To kiss goodnight, or and then it slowly breaks apart as you unpack it. No tongue to mother means literally nothing, right? So there is a kind of acknowledgement that the structure of language does mediate kind of our understanding as well, right? And the fact that she's simply changing the order of certain words, the same words, kind of makes that point, because it very quickly makes no sense. Right? And she kind of gets to that. We didn't talk about page 2, but like the other page of the poem gets at a similar point where she addresses how words can have multiple meanings. Right? In man, the tongue is A, the principal organ of taste, B, the principal organ of articulate speech, C, the principal organ of oppression and exploitation, or D, all of the above. And the answer is, of course, always D, right? Same thing for the first question, and so on and so forth, right? It's always all of it. Right? Language is a very slippery slope. And that's beautiful. That's kind of what's fun about language. But again, baggage. Yes, Mel.
When you said that it doesn't mean anything, I fully disagree, actually.
Please.
I have no mother tongue, no mother to tongue, no tongue to mother tongue me. It feels like she's grieving over having no mother and no, like, matrilineal legacy, no history with her mother, no history to pass on, no one for her to mother, no one to teach her mother stuff too, because all of that was taken away and patriarchally imposed on her with slavery and colonization.
That's a really good reading. Yeah.
To add on to that too, like when you take what she's saying and kind of apply it to the stuff on the side, they're talking about the lack, like what mother would do to give them language, etc.
You're right.
And she is mourning that because she didn't get that.
You're right.
Like on the side, it's kind of maybe comes off graphic or whatever, but it's all about language and getting language. And
yeah.
They're missing that.
And it ties into that last stanza. I must therefore be tongue dumb. Right? The assumption that all of what you both said, right, kind of implies to a lot of people that there is a lack, right? Dumb in the most literal sense of, or it's got a classical sense and not insultive. Well, yes, insultive sense of like missing something. Yeah. Right. Lee had her hand up and then Ash. Yeah.
And I do tie into that as well if you go to the like starting with English is my mother tongue and then so like English is my father's tongue. Like a father tongue is a foreign language, and then like English is a foreign language, it's not a mother tongue. And then looking at the slavery paragraphs, I wonder if it ties into the fact that if we are talking about black slaves, the mother was probably black, but the father may have been a white man who, like, with no like either disadvantage or there's no relation, so therefore she also doesn't know her father, and with her mother being black, there is no relation to the English language. And it seems to be like a story of trying to figure that out.
I kind of lost you there for a second of like the possibility of her father being white. Where do you get that?
With the English being the father's tongue and the father's tongue is a foreign language.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. I didn't necessarily get it as like her father was white, but at least also spoke English, right? It's a generational thing. Right, but that could also be, I guess, yeah. It's just the racial element is not, because it's not brought up in that sense, right? It's a bit difficult to make that reading in the poem, but I can see where you're going, at least thematically speaking. Good, yeah. Ash. Yeah.
I was going to say it reads a lot like mourning what could have been your culture.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's very true. Yeah. And there was a passage that I think reinforces that. Where was it?
Sorry, I'm just picking up.
No. It's good. You're all right. I really like those readings. I was just adding on to this and looking for the passage that I'm thinking of. Yeah, it's in Edict 2, right? I kind of get that sense of what you're talking about. Every slave caught speaking his native language shall be severely punished. Where necessary, removal of the tongue is recommended. The offending organ, when removed, should be hung on high in a central place so that all may see and tremble. Right? It really gets at that sense, I think, of mourning in the most literal way of there is the removal of an appendage that is associated with the death of something as intangible, quote unquote, as language, right? But it's made material in the removal of the tongue, right? Good. All of this is excellent. This makes me think of like 90s hip hop in a way. Maybe that's just, I see some heads nodding yes, so maybe it's not just me. But in that sense of...
You can put a beat to it.
But not only could you put a beat to it, yeah. I mean, a lot of poetry, that is true as well. But what you see in a lot of like 90s hip-hop that you don't see as much anymore, at least not in the hip-hop that I listen to, maybe I'm wrong, is this kind of polyvocal musicality going on where you have kind of one main rapper going for a bit, for a stanza, for a verse or two, and in the background you have people like what we would call typically a hype man, right, also adding on or echoing what was being said, right? To take the Canadian example, because it's all about Canadian literature, you can look up like Dream Warriors, for example. They did a lot of this stuff in their albums as well, right, as a Canadian hip-hop group. So this element of adding many voices in a poetic fashion, I think, kind of plays through in a lot of different mediums. And that's where my mind went, just looking at a poem like this. And it's something that I would encourage you all to do, right? As young readers of literature, green readers of literature. Okay? It's never... I've said this to many students before, and I'll say it again and again. It's never a mistake to make these types of associations in your mind, right? Writers and artists reference each other all the time, right? No art kind of exists in a vacuum. Right? We talked about that explicitly with Armstrong breaking with the sonnet form, not the sonnet form, but breaking with poetic form. For example, right, she's responding to a specific type of cultural moment. And you see it with my response, for example, to Philip, and thinking of like weird, like underground hip hop. Right? Does that mean that it leads to an amazing literary analysis? Not all the time, right? But it does at least open up pathways, right, to explore further connections in our mind. We didn't get to it in its line, but for example, just in my notes, before class I was reading in the library because that's what I do in my free time. And I just happened to read a passage from a E.J. Pratt poem, who, if you don't know, was a rather well-known poet here in Canada in the 30s and 40s. Right? And the poem is called The 6000, and it's about a train barreling through the Canadian prairies. Right? Pratt was very interested in the symbol of the train. Right? And he refers to the train as, in his vast belly was a pit. And in my mind, I immediately went, oh, like Christopher Columbus's ship, right? In history lesson, right? That's like a belly that lets out, right? Christopher and his mom. Was Armstrong thinking of the Pratt poem? Almost certainly not. Maybe, I don't know, right? But the connection holds in the sense that what Pratt is using as an image, right, of the train, right, is one that a lot of Canadian nationalists like Pratt would have also used to demonstrate like civilizational progress, right? The engine of modernity, right? For all its good or bad. Some people were critical of it. Some people were very enthusiastic about it, right? And even if Armstrong does not refer to trains, right, she's referring to these kinds of mechanisms of modernity in a similar fashion, right? And so that's what I mean by making connections, right? Poems and literature does not exist in a vacuum. And I keep making this symbol with my hand, even though it means nothing, because I can't not move.
Because you're thinking of trains.
Yeah, because I'm thinking of trains all the time. That's my obsession when I turned 30, was trains. It's not true. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that as something that may help you, not just with this class, but if you take any other literature class, it's never a bad move to do. Make those connections. Right? It's not a far stretch because sometimes a lot of these poets as well, old and new, self-consciously did this. Sometimes taking entire lines, right, from someone else and saying, okay, now let me make something new with this. Right? So all of these connections should hold. I see that we are nearing 9 p.m. Do we have anything that we want to add? Like, I know this is a lot for a first class. Like, I just dumped so much information onto you from a literary perspective. Yes, Ash.
I'm completely new to literature.
Everyone is here.
Do you have a nice source for a timeline generally of when this contemporary era started versus the romantic era and that kind of stuff?
So you want a timeline of literary history-ish?
Ish, yeah. You don't have to get into everything, but just a generalization.
I would point you to the library. All jokes aside, the library is dope. But obviously I'm not going to be able to do everything here, but I do recommend. You can't go wrong. I know there are some on the second floor. Most literary anthologies, like those big, thick books of the Norton Anthology of Literature or whatever, try to get as modern a version as possible because a lot of those old ones are hella light, right? Which is not to say that they're bad poems or bad works in them. It's just very limited. So try to get a modern one, but a lot of those anthologies actually do feature the timelines and much more detail than you would get here. All right.
Let's start with Mesopotamia.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
So Gilgamesh, right? Who knows when? So you're talking about the Romantics. I made it ridiculously long. I don't know where to situate myself now. Let's put them here. So, in 1798, someone can fact check me on this. Either 1798 or 1789, one of the two. Wordsworth and Coleridge published lyrical ballads, which, to put it in crude terms, lit a fire of the wazoo of literature, right, at the time. In a way that we've kind of lost today, because lyrical ballads is a contradiction in terms that we no longer recognize because we don't really pay attention to these kinds of forms anymore, right? So, lyrical ballads. And so that's really the beginning of a period known as Romanticism. Okay. Again, this can be subject to debate. William Blake was a famous romantic, but he was writing a little bit before. The only problem is that no one read William Blake at the time, so no one cared. Okay. Now we appreciate William Blake, and he's incredible and shockingly progressive, even by today's standards. Like, dude was an abolitionist and like a radical, right? Big supporter of the French Revolution. My guy was like, yep, totally. Guillotine, let's go.
Romantic Satanist.
Oh, yeah. As, yeah, it doesn't matter. Yes, he... No, we're not going to go down this tangent because it's old. So, most people put the beginning of the Romantic period at this time, mostly because that's when people really started to pay attention to that type of poetry, right, and that type of work. And a lot of who we still read today in literature classes emerged in this period, which is why I mentioned earlier that it's really important that contemporary literature tries to break away from it. It's very hard to underestimate just how much of an impact the Romantic period had on literature, right? Because this is a time of, like I said, Coleridge, Wordsworth, the Shelleys, right? We still read Frankenstein, for example. Shelleys. Jane Austen, right? Probably the most famous romantic still today, right? What's really interesting also about this period is that this is kind of a shift. I focused a lot on poetry today, in part because that's basically what was considered literature for most of human history up until this point. And still in this moment, you still see a lot of the big romantics are poets. As I mentioned earlier, Percy Shelley, the poet, was much more famous at the time than his wife Mary, even though now we only really read Mary. Not that we should, Percy is great, but you get my drift. But you see that with the rise of Austen and with the rise of Mary Shelley, you see this transition that really ties us to today into the rise of the novel. Right? Austen is basically the one that created the novel as we understand it today. Were there things that we can kind of call novels before? Yeah, like your Daniel Defoe's and so on in the 17th century, but they're basically different enough and they weren't popular enough that we can really say that it was a big form that people took seriously. And for a big part of that pre-Romantic period, novels were considered like the dregs of literature. You did it because, women bought it. And I'm not even exaggerating here, like it was considered like a lowly womanly form, right? Which at the time was pejorative because misogyny. So the reason why we talk about the Romantic so much is because it set up so many of the standards that we see today, right? Lee, you brought up the perception to ecology, right? Our relation to that. You can read Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey poem for a really good example of this. But also, like I said, right, the shift towards the novel. That'll tide us over until World War I. I just jumped 200 years, I know, but whatever. Where you see the modernists. I'm well aware that there's the Victorian period between then. I don't care about the Victorians. Not that they weren't good. It was just a time that was very much focused on structure and very proper ways of writing poetry, like form above everything. Right? You will never find more technically perfect literature than during the Victorian era. I mean this on like a structural sense. Okay? And in part, that structure came from what they saw the Romantics do. Right? They just did it in their own time. Right? And that kind of firmed itself up in the Victorian period. Read Anthony Trollope, read other Victorians that I can't think of the name of right now. Yes?
I was just going to ask, when you say structurally perfect, you're referring to the novel, not just poetry.
Poetry as well.
Yeah, well, obviously you're talking about poetry, obviously, but not, you're also talking about novels.
Yes, right, like across the board, they took structure very seriously. Yeah. If you want to, like, you were mentioning Ash earlier about taking a creative writing class. If you want to know if you're interested in creative writing and want to like know the story basics, right, like beginning, middle, and end, you can do worse than just reading a Victorian piece, right? It'll give you a really good sense of that, right? Modernists come along and they're like, oh, I hate structure so much, right? I want to break all of it, in part because of World War I. This is oversimplifying it, but it basically devastated people's minds and bodies for obvious reasons. And so the poetry and literature that they were going for was actively deconstructing language. Right, this is where the Gertrude Stein kind of form that I was talking about, like playing with word order. You see T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland come into this, where it's just a bunch of images launched at you, and it technically makes sense, and it's technically readable, but it's also very opaque. Okay. One of the issues, however, with modernism is that the focus on the individual's perception was still very much beholden to the Romantics. They were playing with form, not as much with themes. Okay? This is oversimplifying it. I'm well aware, because I'm oversimplifying it for the sake of time here. But you can kind of paint that broad stroke for a lot of modernists, of still kind of holding on to some of these ideas in a big bad way. And that's why I was emphasizing today that on a literary level, contemporary writers seem to not only be playing with questions of form, like the modernists did, they took that from the modernists, but also are now playing with questions of genre and themes and images. Right? This is where the Timothy Findlay example that I was giving earlier comes in, where he's playing with how you write a novel, but also how you understand history, and how you actively construct a narrative around that, if it's even possible to have the idea of a narrative. This is where we get what I called earlier postmodernism, where in short, we've killed God, in the most like abstract sense of killing God, right? And now our truths can be whatever we want them to be. Is that a good thing? That's for you to decide. I find it interesting, Sometimes a little bit navel-gazing. Like a lot of things, it's not perfect. Nothing is perfect. That was a crash course of literary history since 1798.
Thank you.
Wasn't expecting to do that.
Wait, but a question.
No, please.
How did they all these books? How did you still keep them?
What do you mean?
Over time,
Yeah.
books.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't read.
Yeah.
Over time, they just don't handle it properly. So how did they still keep like Shakespeare and most of this old books still intact for us to still find them? Or do you think we just found pieces of them and just said, this matches this?
Okay, so kind of both. Yeah. So that's the just sad thing about a lot of things before this time, is that we don't have to write it. Shakespeare is kind of an accident in that sense. There's a lot of contemporaries of Shakespeare, to just keep on that example, that we know existed. Like people reference them in letters, for example, that we still have because they survived the test of time. But there's no existing copy of that play. So there's huge swaths of literary history that we just no longer have access to because print technology was not particularly good before the 20th century. You're right, a lot of people just didn't keep copies because sometimes war gets to them. Sometimes just nature happens, right? Like a flood happens and suddenly a book gets destroyed. Oh, there was only one copy of that book. Sucks. We laugh, but that's kind of the reality of a lot of literary history, right? So how do we know? We piece it together based off of what we now have. Well, that was one of the things that was kind of innovative around this time, right? And why we put a lot of emphasis on it is that print was starting to get a little bit more modernized around this time as well, which allowed more copies to circulate. Okay? Public education was also starting around this time, so a few more people were reading, right? Not as much as today, but more. So it allowed more copies to still exist of Jane Austen. In Shakespeare's time, actually, when he was alive, he never saw a printed copy as we would have today of his own works. The first printed copy of Shakespeare happened after he died, right? In part because his friend Ben Jonson kind of helped bring together what existed of, what had been written down, handwritten, and printed it, right? Into this, what we call the folio, right? Which is basically a collection of, even at the time, what existed. We know that Shakespeare wrote plays that we no longer have access to. They simply don't exist. Right? And it sucks, right? It's like a literary what if. Right? If only.
It's funniest play gone.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, Gilgamesh, we have it only because of an accident. It was written on stone tablets, but most of it would have just been oral, as a lot of literature was. Here in North America, before European arrival, a lot of indigenous cultures were oral. Right? The Celts in Ireland were also oral. Right? We don't have those stories anymore. Does that answer your question? I don't know, but you're bringing up a good point of, some of it we just don't have. But we do with what we can with what we have. This is why I can't promise that we'll finish earlier. Okay, I will officially end class because it is 9:00. If you do have any personal questions or if you want to keep talking, or if you just have any general questions, feel free to come to me. But formally, I cannot keep you here any longer. I'll see you tomorrow. Read the Tish poems that I put in the class number 2 file on Moodle.